Thank you, Colin. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me also acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, the Whadjuk Noongar people. I want to talk a little bit about vulnerability from the standpoint of the kind of task that the Commission has had in opening up a dialogue and some thinking around this. I've entitled the talk Vulnerability, Risks, Predictions and Outcomes, and the overview of this talk is in 4 parts. I want to talk a little bit about vulnerability. I'm going to talk then about developmental circumstances, and there's a bit of a story on risks and prediction, and then look at some outcomes across time and place. And in place. I hope the story makes sense. I was telling Craig as I stepped in here, I tend to invent stories for particular presentations, and I haven't given this one a full go, so I guess the proof of the pudding will be in the tasting. Let's see how we go. Let's start at the beginning with a few comments that I'd like to make about vulnerability. And I was kind of curious to look at how the concept had been built upon since its inception around the 1980s. You kind of have, when you kind of wind the service, practice, and research literature back, it appears in the literature with more regular frequency from about the 1980s onward. It's a relatively modern notion. There were very large inputs from the child protection sector around it, and most of those inputs to the notion of vulnerability then concerned how statutory intervention was legitimized. That gave rise, when you kind of look at what got written and produced over that period, to some notable dissatisfactions. There were various sectors that argued it was a very negative, rather overly focused on parental acts, and ignored ecological or structural realities external to the parent and the child. That gave rise to a gradual introduction of the notion of adversities through and into the 2000s. So in kind of stepping into the story of vulnerability, the challenge for the Commission was what would constitute a working definition of vulnerability. And the document, the discussion document that they've produced, steps through that in a really, I haven't been paid to say this, by the way, in a really elegant and thoughtful way. I would think in reading that most of us will find ourselves in that in terms of what we do and what our interests are. Obviously, the question that the Commission needed to ask in its working definition is working for what and who? And I have some things to say about that in this process. One of the places that I need to start with, because of what I do and the interests that I have, is always posing, is vulnerability a status or is it a process? Now, children in out-of-home care, with disabilities, or in youth justice settings, or experiencing homelessness, these children can arguably be said to have a vulnerable status now and into the future. My interests are on the processes of how children are delivered into those statuses. Does that make sense? So I'm kind of working upstream with a curiosity and a healthy interest in the processes that lead to vulnerability. That in no way diminishes the reality of those of you who work with vulnerable children. I don't want to diminish that, and I'll have some things to add to that at the end of the talk. So I'm going to look at a focus on processes that result in vulnerability, And the kind of question that sits in the back of my mind is, what are the developmental circumstances required to encourage or discourage an outcome that we would deem to be a vulnerable outcome? And that takes me to a phrase that I've kind of invented simply because I need to be able to talk with you about it, and I'll explain it now. I'm going to talk a little bit about developmental circumstances, and this is a phrase that I tend to use partly to avoid talking about individual risks, and you'll see how this plays out through the talk this morning. Now, in a fairly cluttered way, there are developmental circumstances for children that make their development move along, that drive development, and I call those prompts, things that really nudge their development. Not all the nudges are necessarily good, but they will drive development. You don't teach a child to walk. That's a biological milestone. Biology, puberty, for example, would that you could deliver that when you want it to be delivered, okay? That's a biological prompt that results in changes that result in other developments around that. As well as other prompts, though, we have expectations and opportunities. And for me, that's part of the excitement of working with children. How do we set ambitious expectations for all children? Who gets them, who doesn't, and why? Obviously, if you're going to set expectations, you have to provide opportunities for those expectations to be realized. Yes? The other things that happen in development are facilitators, things that protect development. They're very handy to have if they're in your toolkit. You don't have to have them, but gosh, they're nice if you do. Things like an easygoing temperament and at least average intellectual ability. Not bad if you can get them. Good language development, very handy. And emotional support, particularly in the time of challenge. Great things if you can get those into a developmental toolkit anywhere in your life, really. And then there are risk circumstances, things that slow development down, multiple accumulative stresses, developmental chaos. And we heard someone talking about her personal experience of developmental chaos. Social inequality. It's an issue because social inequality concentrates opportunities and expectations in the hands of a few and takes them away from others. Social exclusion limits things in terms of of expectations and opportunities. So these are kind of the developmental circumstances that I'll look at when I see somebody coming out, here's a program to intervene and help child development. This is my scoping exercise when I look at what are the effective ingredients in the program. I won't bash on other than to say children develop in place, in context, and through time. We are all pieces of work through time. And to some extent, my interests are in children as a means to an end, and that sounds very cruel, not necessarily an end to themselves. But I do appreciate the difference between beings and becomings where children are concerned. But this is just to remind us that we've got prompts and facilitators at the top that move through time. We have constraints that hinder development that may move through time as well. And we're also set in a world with with national and global events. No one invited the global financial crisis to our doors. And believe me, that had an impact on child development. You can look at the national statistics on that and see the perturbations that occurred through global time, the global downturn. Children develop in place, in context, through time. Okay, how can I be at part 3? You're going to have a very spacious amount of time, Donna. Let me talk a little bit now about risks and prediction. This is actually a meatier part of the story that begins to take us more towards some thoughts about vulnerability. One of the things that happens when we talk about children at risk is that we get distracted by a list of individual risks. This child is in out-of-home care, or this child has a history of it might be an intellectual disability. A risk is a probability. It's a chance that some sort of exposure or an event to an adversity will produce an outcome that we're interested in, or that we may be trying to prevent. And it's very easy to get distracted by individual risks. Believe me, I've spent a lot of my life distracted by individual risks here. I want to give you an example, though, of what Australia can now do, because we're collecting really good child development data and looking at the same children develop over time. These longitudinal data are giving us insights about the way we grow up Australian children that we haven't had before. So I'm going to use one of my favorite risks and show you where it took us and what kind of road we went down with that, and why my opening comment is it's probably not helpful to latch on to and focus on individual risks. I'm going to use the risk of poor language development. I think most of us would realize that language development is one of the great tools of development. Once you have it, you use it for the rest of your life, and you grow it. You grow your vocabulary through time. There's probably with the youth of this audience, there's a time for me where I can go back in my vocabulary and the word Google wasn't in it. We add new vocabulary right through our lives. Well, this is a chart of children growing between the ages of 4 and ages of 10, and what they're growing is their vocabulary. We actually measured the same children over and over again as they grew up. Now, on the left-hand side, we started with where they were when we saw them. And you can see that lower blue group. They're in the lower 15th percentile they have low language development at that age. Now, we've not intervened, we've simply watched what's happened with these children, and look what happened. Off they went. They started shifting position. Some of the blues went right to the top, into the middle, and so forth. Yes, there's a very tiny little cluster of blue dots that seem to hang around the bottom. You might be interested to know they're not always the same children hanging around in the bottom. But one of the things that child development does is it provides a great deal of variability as we develop. There's lots of developmental movement. We're not on railroad tracks. We're not rockets. Okay, that's not how it works. There's plenty of movement. And if you think about it, we're not so badly made that if being in the 15th percentile of vocabulary mattered, we'd be seeing a lot more difficulties later in life. We're pretty robust specimens. So this is a typical pattern of change in child development over time. Well, we were interested to look at what happened to the 318 children who were 4 years old that started low, and said, let's just track them and see what happened. And just in a nutshell, 120 of them went on to be low at 8 years. Some of them switched and wound up average or high. And guess what? Over there in the ones that started at 4 in middle or high, some of them switched camp too by the time they were 6 years. Now, I'm not going to bash on about this, but that's what happened. Okay? It's like a pinball machine. You've got kids moving around and changing categories, and this is me looking at one risk, the risk of low language. Now, when you look at that, we thought, well, maybe we can predict that pattern a little better if we get a lot, I'm going to call them favorite risks. They're not. These are the risks that really matter for language development. We had 11 of them that we measured on all of these children. We could clearly demonstrate that these things made their language change between the ages of 4 and 8. But the punchline was, when we tried to predict, and as a policymaker, I might be interested in, can I locate the 4-year-old children that are at risk for being low when they're 8. Okay? Wouldn't that be neat? Okay? When we actually tried to apply the machinery of prediction, we predicted that 1,083 children would be low. When we actually revisited them at 8, 279 were low. Okay? Our prediction was crummy, and we had some of the best predictors of language development. Okay? So when we try to predict, things get very messy. We only correctly predicted 28% of the children that were low, and we probably would have, and maybe that's okay. Maybe we look at that and say, well, we're willing to treat or deliver services to 1,083 children if we manage to reach the 279. Now that's a policy decision. It's connected to money and how services are delivered. So we can't reliably predict, using as an example here of favorite risks or a collection of risks in the model. And one can get quite disappointed, twisted, and bitter about that. But it's a feature of the way children develop. And it's one of the features that result in us deciding, well, what we'll do is we'll wait for a child to arrive at a vulnerable status and then we'll take action, because it's very hard to predict. So, as I've said, when we focus on individual risks of children becoming vulnerable, it doesn't take you very far in policy terms. This is when you focus on individual risks. It doesn't allow service design or redevelopment. It rarely matches what people experience in adversity and what people actually talk about that matters to them. And it aims too firmly at individuals and leaves the system out of the thing. It all becomes, about Fred or about Angela or whatever you have there. So that takes me to part 4 of my talk, and it sort of picks up the story of, well, what would you do? How would you look at the story of West Australian children growing through time and in place? How might we want to think, or how could someone working in public health and population health, some bloke in a white shirt in an ivory tower up at a university, what on earth could people like myself and my team kind of offer this this kind of dialogue? And I hope this interests you. Children and their families are exposed to a varying number of risks that affect the level and the rate of their child development. And they certainly can produce higher rates of poor development that lead to vulnerability outcomes. I'm not denying that for a minute. We got curious, our team got curious, and this goes back to the developmental circumstances that I talked about earlier. Well, what happens when we look at risk as a developmental circumstance across time, in places, and in populations of children? Do we get a different view of this? Rather than looking at a particular type of child, what happens when you look at populations of children? Yes, there are risks for poor child development, but they don't occur one at a time. Here's your lot, you get one of these. They run in packs, they occur in batches. And people working in the sector completely understand that. Risks also vary in length, intensity, and duration. It's not a matter of them being switched on a Monday and switched off on a Tuesday. These circumstances may offer a different way of thinking about how to design intervention strategies for vulnerable children. Now, this is a fancy pants kind of diagram that deals with it really deals with the fact that risks run in packs. The darker purple colors show us where risks tend to line up together. So, for example, in that upper right-hand corner, you see those dark purple boxes. That's telling us when you're on a healthcare card, you've got a very low income. Well, other clusters of risks include large family size, mothers who are not able to work, not reading to a study child, maternal psychological distress, the whole thing, the whole 9 yards kind of sit there as things that are persistently cited in both the literature and in clinical and service experience to matter a lot about the management and raising of children and their likelihood of vulnerability. And again, I'm just struck by the short little interview clip that we had that picked up some of these themes just in the story of the young woman. Now you can take a map like this and give it a good squeeze statistically, and it tells you something quite particular about the West Australian child population. We were interested in what the 170,000 children in WA who were between birth and age 4 looked like when we took a look at them with that heat map of risks that you just saw. And what you discover there is that about half of the West Australian population of children are what we call developmentally enabled. They don't use many services. They stay developmentally on track as they get older. They just stay persistently on track as they move from age 4 to 10. We're looking at here. However, we had other children that were confronted with quite different developmental growth. We had about 20% of the WA population of children living in working poor families. They grew more slowly. They grew, but they grew more slowly. We had about 10% of children who were in overwhelmed families. Everything that could go wrong was going wrong. Another 9% that for a variety of reasons, principally health reasons, the child was developmentally delayed. There was a biological basis to what was having to be worked with in order to assist both the child and the family. And then we had some families that were characterized by what we called low human capital. And these were principally teenage mothers, sole teenage mother families. And then we were interested because of the circumstance that, well, not just Western Australia faces, but the entire globe faces. We had policy concerns about families that were non-English speaking families. These are principally refugee and migrant families. So that's what the developmental circumstances look like. We don't have a different circumstance for every child. There are some clusters of circumstances here that are very useful to know about. One of the things that we were able to do is diagram or chart how these children grow. Now I want to take your gaze right to the bottom. Do you see that orange line at the bottom? Those are the developmentally enabled kids. That's kind of the desirable place. They're on time at every age. There's no difference between their, as it were, their chronological age and how they're developing. They're really tracking well. Everybody else occupies a slightly different space. Have a look at the blue line. Those are the non-English speaking children. They are rocketing along. They've come into a setting now that's providing an enriched level of development for them, and they're moving as fast as they can towards that orange line. That's pleasing to see. Kids can do some of this. The other line, of course, of interest is the yellow line. They're the overwhelmed families. So this began taking our group down the track of thinking about what do these developmental circumstances suggest our policies and services might look like. And this, of course, will be left with the Commission and on their, I presume on their website. It certainly will be made available to you to see. I'm not going to drill down on all of these for you, but there's quite a rich level of description of each of the groups that we can produce. The work is completely peer-reviewed and published for academics that say, are you making it up? I don't think we're making it up. But this will give you a taste of, I'll give you a taste of one of them. We've got about 80,000 WA children who are developmentally enabled. Now their typical circumstance, not their exclusive their typical circumstances, they tend to have slightly older mothers. Both mothers and fathers are more educated, smaller families, no multiple stresses. They have a stress now and again, but are managing this, prevalent book reading. The child is developing on time and very robustly. If we were designing policies for this developmental circumstance, I'd want to maintain developmental encouragements and opportunities, really making good information available. I'd want to monitor this percentage. This is a group we'd like to grow. I'd like to get that above 50%. If we could, and probably the provision of light touch universal interventions is sufficient. It's good enough to make that happen. Let's do another one. Let's look at the working poor families. About 34,000 children living in this circumstance. These families are cash poor and time poor. The parents are working. That's often deemed to be a desirable thing. They're working. But their work is putting them, on average, about half of them in the fourth quintile of income. They're larger families, relatively low maternal education, and they're living in disadvantaged areas. Well, if we were and child development in these children is 6 months late and it stays that way. It's not changing rapidly over time. Well, if I were thinking of the policies that we might want to have in places for these children, well, we might legitimately think about family benefit increases, better pay, parent education and training to try to boost their income. It's not helping them hanging around with a low income. We'd probably want to enrich early education and childcare and create better and more family-friendly workplace arrangements. Isn't that a constant promise for all of us? I don't see it happening. But we'd like to see more of that and services. Now, I'm not going to go and talk about, I will talk about this one and then we'll wrap up. These are the overwhelmed families, about 10% of children that live in this circumstance, and about everything that can go wrong is going wrong with them. They're readily identifiable. They have diminished capabilities to use existing services, and they really require developmental support. So we'll leave that there, and I'm going to move through this, the other groups fairly quickly. And this, which you can't read, kind of took me to, or you'll see, if you can, you're a better person than I am, took us to, well, if we were thinking about the policy prerogatives for the various families or developmental circumstances from enabled, overwhelmed, low human capital, working poor, children with developmental delay, and non-English speaking families, there are lots and lots of different things that are on the ground in Western Australia moving around and available. They're not, in my view, probably being deliberately considered enough and put in place and in position. So, for example, if we were looking at providing and promoting light touch universal interventions, parenting programs, local mothers groups, play groups, community development aimed at quality opportunities for children, rec facilities, safety and area enhancement, library programs. There are boodles of things that are absolutely effective in promoting better child development, and they actually work for all of those groups. So you've got a selection of things that can be done, as it were, for everybody, and then there are some things, for example, early, repeated, sustained developmental support, and I'll use the example of child and family centers that really need to be provided where you've got higher proportions of overwhelmed families. My interest, and this allows me to start to sum up around this, can be kind of stated as follows. Some children are vulnerable by virtue of the status they occupy. Services for these children are taken up by demands and requirements for their management and treatment. It's all hands to the pump when you've got kids that are in these circumstances. And my hat's off to anybody and everybody that rolls their sleeve up to be there for families and children like that. There are challenges in devoting service time towards prevention. I completely understand that. Reducing child vulnerability requires a complementary approach to treatment and management, and it requires policies and practice that address the developmental characteristics of children, who we aim at prevention at applying a mix of policy prerogatives. Well, you can only mix those policy prerogatives if you understand what the children look like in the place that they live. And it requires governance for local priorities or action zones, where and how we do it. We all suffer from the perennial challenge of how do we get services to work together to effectively do that. And quite honestly, until more of that happens, much of what I'm talking about remains out of reach. If I had one plea for service providers and policymakers, it would be to be sure you actually know the developmental circumstances of your local child population. You don't need to know this perfectly. Reasonable estimates. Do you have more overwhelmed families? Fewer? Where are the families that are developmentally on track? How are they mixing with other children and families? You need to know something about the numbers of children you're actually targeting, because that determines your scale, effort, and impact. You need to think about the size of the population before you design your intervention strategies. I would also comment that universal services are important because of their quality and reach in that. Not exclusively so, but they need to be there where the children are. Finally, the research evidence establishes what works. Most intervention effects actually are very small. That's nothing to cry over. They require persistence, and if there were silver bullets, we'd have figured that out a long time ago. What I would say is we don't know how to get intervention opportunities nearer to the individuals that want or need them. And we talk too much about client access rather than service reach. There are clients that cannot access, and there's very little that can be done without reorientating a service towards how it reaches. Place-based initiatives are absolutely sensible, but can governance arrangements change how things get arranged, located, and close to wants and needs? Thank you very much.